Karl's Chronicles. We finished up Revelation and I kind of took a week off. But I wanted to start to prepare us for the next section. I thought I would do some stuff out of the Book of Dainel since we're doing prophecy. And Daniel can be rather a cryptic book. So we just want to talk a little bit about it here today before we really get started. A lot of people believe that Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC. And they believe this as generally the higher critics because of the prophecies. You know, Daniel couldn't have predicted such and so therefore it had to be written closer to the time. Many associate the book and its writings with that of Antiochus Epiphanes or Antiochus IV, and that these predictions were fulfilled in his lifetime. And that's where the Book of Dainel really stays. This is more of a preterist view that these things really all happened in the past. They have no portents for the future. Daniel really isn't prophetic in that sense. And being written in the 2nd century because naturally one can't foretell the future. That's the humanist, that's the historical critical approach. And you might wonder because in the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered around 1946, 45, they found several copies of the Book of Dainel. And the book itself had a very important place among the Essenes of the Qumran community. This is dated to about the middle of the 2nd century, so around 150. It'd be pretty close to the time that the higher critics are saying this book was written. And for it to have that kind of status at that time, I mean, this is hot off the press, so to speak, even though they were handwritten. The idea is that the book wouldn't have been codified by then. Certainly not. And they have that much importance to the community. And they have especially, I think if I'm top of my head, there were something like on the order of 5 copies at least found on the Book of Dainel. And, or fragments thereof. And if this is the case, the origin of the book has to date back even further than the middle of the 2nd century. And so the higher critics are just going by human thinking, human reason, that prophecies can't be true, that you really can't predict the future, therefore this had to be written around the time that these events took place. It shows that the book has the mark or the hand of God upon it, and that the book dates back even earlier. Now, according to the book itself, it dates back to the middle of the 5th or 6th century BC, and the time of, to the time of Daniel. And that's generally where I place it, because it just doesn't make any sense to put it in the 2nd century BC when the book had that much importance in the Qumran community before it was even had time to have that new book smell wear off. So we're going to look at it, and we're going to look at it from that point of view. Now, it's interesting that with it being a book of prophecy, you think it would be located in the book of prophets in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible is what Christians call the Old Testament. It's the same number of books. All the writings are there. They just have a different order. And in the Jewish book, it's referred to with using the acrostic Tanakh. And that's the T for Torah, first 5 books. The Yin sound, the Nun for the Nevi'im. Nevi was a prophet. Nevi'im is plural, the prophets. And then the writings, the Ketuvim. And so those 3 sections. And it's interesting that Daniel's not found in the Nevi'im section. It's found in the Ketuvim. It's found in the book of the writings. And that's interesting. So while Daniel is found in the Ketuvim, not the Nevi'im, the book of the section of the prophets, what I've been able to find is that there's no real good reason why it's not in the prophets. Some have made speculations, but they seem to come up short. But it finds its place in the book of the writing. As I said earlier, the book itself goes back, I believe, to to the 6th century when Daniel was writing it. And you can kind of almost date the chapters and parts of it when he was, especially in the prophecy parts, chapter 7 on, about what year it was that he wrote those, or had those visions. And it talks about the bigger picture of not just the release of Israel, or the release of the Jews back to Jerusalem, which is what is on Daniel's mind. He's looking to restore the people back to Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple. He says in his prayer in chapter 9, it basically doesn't make God look good. It's the people who have sinned, and he wants God now to come forth and to show who he is and have his rightful place in the world and restore the temple, restore his dignity, so to speak. And he's not really thinking about the last days, not like we are. But there's that overtone, that bigger story. In fact, it's that bigger story, I think, that upsets Daniel a little bit, where he prays in chapter 9, thinking that maybe their captivity is going to be longer than 70 years that had been predicted. And that's why he prays the way he does. And but God is showing him a bigger picture. Not just the deliverance and return of the Jews from Babylon back to to Jerusalem in Judah, but about the ultimate deliverance at the end of the age, the ultimate release of God's people. And we've talked about that in the book of Revelation. We talked about that with the 6th plague there in chapter 16, verses 12 to 16, where the bowl was poured upon the river Euphrates and it dried up, preparing the way for the kings of the east. That was a picture of the deliverance of God's people who were held captive in the end time Babylon, and how God is preparing for their release. And so this bigger picture that we're going to see in the book of Daniel is really what God is doing to restore all things, to put things back the way they were before man entered the rebellion. You see, when Satan tempted Adam and Eve, they entered the rebellion. They became not just sinners, but it's as if they joined the ranks of the army attacking God. They picked up the weapons to attack him. And that's why when we become Christians, when we accept Christ and become justified, Paul writes there in chapter 5 of Romans, being justified, we have peace. And the peace is that we have laid our weapons down. We're no longer at war with God. And that's what God is doing, is he's shifting this whole thing back the way it was before rebellion came in. And the book of Daniel is going to help us see that, and we're going to all tie some of that in with the book of Revelation, because they dovetail together. Where Daniel ends, Revelation picks up the story. And so they fit together perfectly. They're the two books that are really strictly eschatological books dealing with the end time. And so it's interesting how 500-600 years apart that they were written, that they fit so closely together. And so we're going to take a journey through some of that. And the book is generally in two parts. The first part is chapters 1 to 6, which are the narratives, but even that follows a pattern that picks up, and we'll talk about that, and how it picks up with the rest of the book. But it's not just some stories off to the side, and then you get to the good part, the second part, all the prophecy and the end time stuff. But it gives a picture of God, who he is. It gives a picture of the journey that we're on, how God brings us in. And it's a very important part. Together, all 6 chapters together tell the story. It's not just in one place. Together we have to see the bigger picture and how it relates. So we'll spend some time with that, and then we'll get into the last prophecy. They talk about these visions in chapters 7 to 12, and we may be seeing several different visions, but it's really all one story, how they hook together. It's a continuation of the one big story, one big vision, think of it, even though it was in pieces across time. And so it's not just, these aren't isolated things. You can't isolate chapter 7 from 8 and 9 and 10, etc. They're all connected, and they tell this one big picture. And so we'll see how that unfolds. And interesting, we're going to get into chapter 11 with that, especially when in Adventist history, chapter 11 was a big thing because it dealt with the king of the north at the end when he comes in. Who is the king of the north? And for 70 years maybe within the denomination, in the 1880s, about 1952, officially within the church was held the idea that the king of the north was the Ottoman Turks, the sick man of the east. And that all changed in 52, but it didn't change to something new. It actually went back to the original view that many in the church held, including James White, who was at odds with Uriah Smith regarding the king of the north. And so, what is this? Chapter 11 is not an easy thing to discuss. A lot of different views on it. They've been having some symposiums on it here in the last few years. They're in Barron Springs, Michigan. Some interesting things that are brought out, but it's still not necessarily an easy chapter. But the story can be still understood, even if you can't dissect every piece of it, and we won't do that here because I don't feel confident that I can do that. I mean, if you want speculation, you can go other places and they'll speculate, and I can speculate right along with the best of them. And that's all that is, speculation. But I want you to understand the story before you start speculating about how it's unfolded in real time. And when you see the story, you'll understand the picture, and that might help you see it in real time. And so we'll get to that. Daniel 11, people had asked me for over 20 years to teach on that, and I avoided it almost like the plague. And last year I finally did approach it, and I did a 3-part series on it for the first time. And I promised them I wasn't going to tell them exactly what it meant, and I held true to that. But I did tell them the story. They knew the story of it. It's kind of like what we did with the Book of Revelation. I tried to tell you the story of the book so that you can see how it unfolds across time, what God is doing to restore justice. And so not to answer every single piece and how it's going to unfold on earth. You know, that wasn't the bit that we were doing. So with the Book of Daniel, I hope to be able to unfold some things there with that, make it interesting for you, give you some things to think about in your study of Daniel, and to kind of dovetail that in with the Book of Revelation. Now these things we talk about here, I'm not trying to be dogmatic about them. I just want to share what my journey is, and hopefully you can pick up some pieces to make your study and your journey more interesting and more fulfilling. And that's all we're trying to do here. And any questions or anything, you're certainly welcome to send them in. My email is always at the end of the program. In fact, we're still trying to put a program together with my friend Rocky Gale, where we want to do a question and answer session. And but we need questions that we're going to answer. Otherwise, it's pretty much of a short show. So if you have questions, some Bible questions that you'd like to put in, specifically for the Karl and Rocky show, you can do that. And we'll be happy to put them in. So as we prepare to look in the Book of Daniel, maybe you might want to, if you want to go with me on this journey, do some reading on it, read the book, get familiar with the chapters, so as we discuss them here, you can kind of go along with what I'm saying, and kind of put some things together for your own study. And maybe we can learn some things together. So for now, I'm just going to let that set season, and maybe next week we'll start in on chapter 1. And maybe I'll do an overview of the 6 chapters first before we actually do chapter 1. And so that you can kind of see how the whole thing is together, like what I was talking about earlier. I'm sure that sounded a little cryptic. And so maybe we can get started on that journey next time. The following week I won't probably be doing one because I'll be up in Kingman. And I'll be there even on Sunday, so we probably won't have one that week. And but I'll be able to get one together for the following week. So in the meantime, happy study, happy reading.